What is going on, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to another edition of the Jays for Days podcast. I'm Josh. He's Josh. We got Jays Jumpers, Jaron Jackson Jr.'s, John Morant's, Joe Johnson's, Ja Raffs, of course. We've got Jays. We got him for days. Josh, how you doing?
Happily Major League Soccer opening weekend. I know that's high up there on your calendar, so wanted to recognize it.
Very nice, very nice. How are the Union looking this year?
Favorites.
Jeez, so that means they 100% will not win an MLS Cup this year.
You know.
Suppose it's as good a place as any to start, though.
Yeah, it is fascinating how many going through kind of the anonymous, the anonymous executive predictions and stuff. Just how many? Yeah, it's a weird spot to be, but we shall see. I'm just happy the league is back.
Is it like a full slate this weekend, or is it just like a couple games?
Very nice. It's everybody.
Very nice, very nice. MLS is back. How about that? Means that fall is really coming around, right? Not fall, spring.
Yeah. This is kind of right. This is kind of the start. You got Major League Baseball starting to report. We're in the final weeks of the college basketball regular season. Yeah, it's
Daytona 500 was last weekend. Mm-hmm. I think speaking of racing, I think the newest F1 Drive to Survive, I think it released today.
There you go.
How about that? But yes, it's much more bearable around these Indianapolis parts. Of course, the low today is like 26, which isn't all that. Which is, it could be way worse, but also when spring really hits, there won't be any lows of 26. But yesterday it was like 60 and sunny, so
yeah,
we're kind of.
I was gonna say it's been 70 this week a couple times, so
we're in that part of the year that places with actual seasons kind of play jump rope with the seasons. I mean, Michigan had like yet another winter vortex the last like few days, and there's ice all over the place. Not that far north of here, so. Definitely playing jump rope, but we're getting closer to those bearable numbers on a consistent basis. Okay, let's talk college hoops. College podcast today, much more about what's been going on off the basketball court than what's going on it. We'll get back to that on Monday, but with what has been going on with the University of Alabama men's basketball program, we decided that we were going to dedicate a podcast to what happened on the Tuscaloosa Strip. It's the last joke I'll make on this podcast, but the Tuscaloosa Strip. Yeah. Forget the Vegas Strip. Forget Broadway in Nashville. Forget Broadway in New York. Just forget it all. Just give me the Tuscaloosa Strip. It's got to be very Broad Ripple-esque, right? That's kind of what I'm imagining. It's probably a little more spectacular than that.
Yeah.
But that's kind of what I'm imagining. It's definitely a place that is way more spectacular if you're a student in Tuscaloosa than it is if you are literally anything else. But that's the last joke I'll make on the podcast. Plenty has happened surrounding what happened on January 15th. Darius Miles and the capital murder charges that have been handed down. And then over the last 5 days, the involvement of the best player on maybe the best team in the country, in Brandon Miller, a guy who's supposed to be one of the 5 guys taken off the board first in this spring's NBA draft. And his involvement in what happened on January 15th and the subsequent responses to that by head coach Nate Oats, and what was just an absolute swing and a miss the first time he talked to reporters about Brandon Miller's involvement in what happened on the night of the incident. And then we had Jim Stanbridge, who is Brandon Miller's attorney, claiming that that he didn't know the gun was there. That was alleged. That was first reported that Brandon Miller brought the gun to the scene of the crime, but that it was really just Miles who had asked him to bring the gun to him, and he didn't know it was there and wasn't involved in no handing of the gun whatsoever. So there's clearly plenty to unpack here. I don't know. We'll just kind of hop into it. We don't want to spend a ton of time with the legal language that's gone on here, and kind of trying to lay everything out, because that's been done. We can link articles in the podcast notes if necessary to give people context. But at this point, I feel like everybody has seen a lot of the stuff that we are talking about from what is being reported to have happened, the statements that both Nate Oats and the University of Alabama and Miller's attorney have brought. So this is more commentary, talking through it, trying to talk through kind of what this means and how this impacts the sport of college basketball, but also just how these things are kind of being handled. So with that being said, if there's anything you kind of want to make sure is included off the top that I didn't specifically kind of allude to there, please do. But then we'll just kind of hop into this conversation.
Yeah, I want to. You did a nice job laying out the sort of 9,000 foot view, whatever the phrase is, of kind of where we're at. I'm not surprised. I just continue to be frustrated by people's inability to bring nuance to situations like this, because we're at a point where there is information that is important, not necessarily in the legal sense in terms of getting whether Brandon Miller gets charged or not. Like you said, that's not really the conversation we're trying to have, and it's kind of already been had. But just from a moving forward standpoint, from a Alabama basketball status standpoint, there is important information out there that we do not know, we may never know, and probably only Brandon Miller knows, in terms of his attorney's job is to defend him, protect him, present his side of the story.
Mm-hmm.
That is somebody who is paid to be biased.
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily untruthful, but biased, right? To try and create a specific narrative that benefits Brandon Miller. Does that mean that what he said is completely false? No, of course not. It also doesn't mean that is exactly what happened and those are the only facts that matter, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then on the other side of this, just because, or I guess, let me back up for a second. So, right, so you got the one side of the, look, that's what his attorney said, so we just need to kind of move on. That there's some kind of agenda against Alabama because people are still questioning Brandon Miller's actions, even though that's what his attorney said. Yeah, because that's what his attorney said. And then the second part is that you also can't go completely in the other direction with this, because and you know this, I'm a very, very big believer in individual accountability. And that we don't know how exactly everything played out, the thought process that Brandon Miller was going through. But it is possible that, right, according to what his attorney is saying and the story that's being presented, that because this phrase was used of provided the gun, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which has connotations that I think everybody jumped to, and definitely including me. I think we almost took that a little bit too literally, which isn't necessarily anybody's fault because that's the information we were going off of. Mm. But right, if he if what his attorney is saying is accurate, that is a completely different story than the original idea of he was providing the weapon in terms of intentionally get right. We don't know what happened in the middle, and so this idea that you can sort of put this into one box or the other, to me, is just you can't do it. We don't. Nobody knows enough to have some kind of definitive conclusion about all of this, and you know everybody is entitled to their opinion about whether he should be playing and all of that. But I just, again, we see this all the time with things, right? People just get dug into their side and don't want to have a conversation about how things change when new information comes, or this idea that maybe it's just not as black and white as that this is a very messy gray area, because I don't want to go too far in just attaching responsibility to Brandon Miller that shouldn't be. And also, I don't want to ignore the fact that regardless of exactly what his role was, right, he was involved in some way, shape, or form in a series of events. And by the way, Jaden Bradley was there too. So this is 3 Alabama men's basketball players involved in a series of events that led to a 23-year-old woman losing her life and could have ended much worse. Right? That can't be excused either. And so it's like everything in life, it's gray, not black and white. So I guess that's where I wanted to start, is just laying that part out, because we just don't know.
And that's where, like, I think it's irresponsible. Here's my biggest issue with all of it, essentially, is the jumping to conclusions from everybody's like I'm talking everybody, like, because you get the gut reaction, right, and the instant reaction on Twitter and that kind of thing that comes immediately from Brandon Miller was involved in this incident, right? And then, right, you use the term provided definitely has a connotation. I still think that the term provided is accurate.
In a very literal sense, it is regardless, right?
Right. Yeah. In a very literal sense, it is accurate. There was a gun in his car, whether he knew it or not. There was a gun in his car, and he brought it to a murder scene. That is factual. That is what happened. And but framing it the way that it was framed immediately led to this. And even me, super upset, talking to you using phrases like accessory to murder. And if that's, and if there is, and if even half of what his attorney said is true, then that was jumping far too far, way too far. But there was still like I keep coming back to this idea of, if Brandon Miller wasn't the best freshman in the country and about to be the number 3 overall pick, what would, like, if he was just a student at Alabama right now, what would his life look like 6 weeks after this incident? Like what would be going on? And that's not really, like, there's part of me that's like, it doesn't matter, because he's the most important basketball player on the number 2 team in the country. But there's, just like there was a jumping to conclusions from the public after the initial reports that Brandon Miller was involved. Brandon Miller played in a college basketball game 2 days after this happened, and as frustrated as I am, both with myself for jumping to some conclusions and the rest of the public, there is no way, shape, or form that he should have played that basketball game on January 17th. And so from everybody's angle, there's a jumping to conclusions. And Nate Oats can say all he wants to about not trying to belittle the tragedy that happened on that night, but that is exactly what he did in the first time he talked to reporters.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure we'll get to it.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm super and I'm talking in circles about this, but I'm right there with you that everybody involved here, and I don't know, like there's part of me that there's part of me that wonders if the the outlets originally reporting did their due diligence. There's part of me, I'd love to know just how accurate and how spinning the statement from the attorney is, like all of these things that we'll probably never know. But like it's like the thing before it came out that Brandon Miller was a part of it and all of those things. We seem to have gotten to a final conclusion like weeks ago within the Alabama athletic department. And this week we're all learning, like, you cannot tell me that on January 17th you knew for sure 100% that Brandon Miller wasn't involved in a malicious way in what happened 2 days prior. Because you know what someone who helped murder somebody is not going to do? Tell you immediately that he was involved with it if there's a way for him to. And that's not, and believe me, that is not me trying to say that Brandon Miller is lying here. That is not what that is. That's just saying that if someone was, that someone is not going to openly admit their exact involvement in an issue like that if they can get away with not telling you their exact involvement. And that, starting with the Alabama basketball team side of things and kind of getting into the public side of things, that's the thing that's the most frustrating here.
Yeah, and that's really, I think you and I are on similar wavelengths with this. Of I don't really have much of an interest in having a conversation whether Brandon Miller should be playing right now, because again, we don't know. I have kind of the
but I would argue that not knowing means he shouldn't be playing. And sure, if you don't know, then you should default to not playing that guy.
And that's 100% valid. In terms of, right, if I just, my personal opinion of if you're taking all of this information, should he be playing or not, we don't have the information I need to make that decision. So, sure. Yeah, right, we can go around in circles about that. Everybody's entitled to their opinion. That's an absolutely valid one of, maybe just take a step back on this. Yeah. Mm-hmm. The one of the biggest frustrations I have, though, is what you were getting at in terms of, and this is one of the things I said to you when we were texting about this, the way that this has been framed from the beginning. And I don't know how much of this was for legal reasons. I don't know how much of it was for completely selfish reasons. I don't know. But at least I feel like this was presented as an isolated incident involving Darius Miles. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
Outside of the actual consequences for people, just the idea that none of this came out until a month later due to court proceedings is an awful look for Alabama.
Yeah.
Regardless of how you want to handle it and whether people agree with the way you handle it or not. Because it's and I was thinking about this last night as I was kind of preparing for this. It's kind of, I totally understand why you would leave Brandon Miller out of games right now, but it's kind of weird because it's about something that happened a month ago, right? The only new thing here is that it's public information, and so you're doing this based off of public perception, which...
Oh, yeah. No, I when I say out of games, right, like, I mean, he should not have played since January 15th.
Right. You said January 17th was that game afterward, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And not right. That wasn't, that's, I'm with you on that part, that I don't think it's getting talked about enough, is we're debating it now. Mm-hmm. Why aren't we going back and asking those questions immediately afterward? And then you get that paired with, and I think what Nate Oates was trying to say was basically trying to be consistent with the message that Brandon Miller's attorney put out, right? I think that's what he
in
was.
in retrospect, yes, because the attorney's statement had not come out by
Correct.
by the time he was
right, which is an important detail. I think that's what he was trying to do. However, what he did was, instead of saying everything to actually explain what he was trying to say, or say nothing, which again, I don't know, how much can you say because of legal reasons? I don't know all of that. But instead of doing one or the other, he went in the middle, which is, I would argue, the worst thing you could do. Because then he says stuff like wrong place, wrong time without any context.
Yeah.
And regardless of whether that's actually how you feel based on what, law enforcement have told you about what happened and what Brandon Miller has told you and, Brandon Miller's interviews with law enforcement, saying that when, again, three of your players, and I know that was specific to Brandon Miller, but three of your players were somehow connected to this. It could have been much worse. And you said that right after what happened at Michigan State, which is one of the things you said to me, is that is the wrong place, wrong time.
Yeah.
What has happened since, and right, the statement coming out to kind of explain what Nate Oates was trying to say, to me almost doesn't even matter. It's an awful look from the start to the finish in terms of how Alabama has handled this. Because either you've got to be upfront with the information and say, okay, you can still defend Brandon Miller and you don't have to just jump to bad conclusions, but you could just say, look, here's the information we have from law enforcement. Brandon is cooperating with authorities out of just respect for the sensitivity of the situation and to make sure it's handled correctly. Right, we're just not going to play him for a little bit. It could have been as simple as that. Or you could have gone up there and said, there is more information that we have, or we feel like the way that this is presented doesn't tell the whole story. This is not the place to discuss that. We need to keep the focus on the victim here. Right? There's so many different things you could have done, and instead of basically trying to defend Brandon Miller without actually bringing the evidence, which is essentially what Nate Oates did.
Yeah, I have zero. I'm almost to the point where I don't care what the Alabama athletic department does at this point, because everything at this point is a reaction rather than just doing the due diligence up front. Nate Oates came out and clarified his statements because he got buried for straight up belittling the murder of a mother. That is what happened in the first. He came in and clearly his sole point was to belittle the event and belittle Brandon Miller's involvement in it. And so at this point, anything Alabama does is because of the public reaction. So I don't you get no brownie points, you get no bonus points, you get nothing for what you do post the reports that Brandon Miller was involved coming out.
Because they chose to do nothing when they knew about it and nobody else did. Exactly.
Right. And that is and that is where, and you can give me a billion reasons why Brandon Miller played in that January 17th game when there's no way on God's green earth you had all the details. You can give me all the reasons in the world. But the reason he played over all else is because you didn't want to lose to Vanderbilt on the road. That is why he played. And that is why, even though you knew, because I mean, and Nate Oates said it, he said, I was aware that Brandon Miller was there.
Right.
Like, we knew that Brandon Miller was there. And these things just don't happen that fast. They don't. You don't get details that fast. And so now we're at this place where, and right, maybe they were told not to say anything, which I have different issues with.
Mm-hmm.
But it just reeks with the whole thing reeks with the smell of, we're doing everything we can to protect our basketball team from an incident where somebody was murdered. And honestly, they don't really seem to care about that part of it. I mean, they're doing a really good job. Well, they're working on saying the right things. But like the fact that you have to come out with a statement because the thing you missed was valuing what actually happened, like the actual outcome, the actual tragedy, like that is what Nate Oates had to do. He had to come out and say, "Oh, I'm really sorry. I forgot to basically respect what had actually happened and that a son lost his mother." Like that boils my blood, because that like how is that not how do you not spend 5 minutes talking about that when you sit down in the freaking chair? The first time, like before you say anything else, before you take any questions, you should spend 3 minutes using all of the factual evidence that you have to pay condolences to the person that lost their life. Because we know, like those things we know, right? We're talking semantics at this point about whether or not a guy did or didn't know that the gun was in his car.
Mm-hmm.
We know that one of Nate Oates' basketball players murdered somebody. And we know, so like, we're jumping to the, well, let's make sure that Brandon Miller looks as good as possible in this. But, instead of some of the others, and I know that, right, it wasn't the very first time that he had talked about what had happened. So there's some of that as well. But I'm just, I am, and I texted you this in a, half joke. Like, I hate the lens through which so many things are looked at because of college sports. It drives me absolutely bananas. And this is about the ugliest form of it, because I mean not all that often does the best player in college basketball this year, one of them, end up in the same spot as him, like literally bullet holes in his car, close to a murder. Mm-hmm. And the gun was just retrieved from his car, and it just reeks of, we need this guy to play basketball for us more than anything else. And maybe that's a little bit unfair, but to the people whose job it is to protect Brandon Miller, Nate Oates included, right? That's part of his job, is to protect his players. But I almost don't like myself that we've spent this entire podcast like not really paying respects to the person that died. Like, we're talking about a murder and we haven't said the woman's name yet. Mm-hmm. And that kind of rubs me the wrong way. But also, I mean, that's not anybody's fault. It just is. And I don't know. It's one of those things I could talk in circles about for days without making an actual point, because it's just, I don't know. It's indicative of kind of what the most important thing seems to be when people talk about this right now, and that's whether or not Brandon Miller is going to keep playing basketball, which is part of the very core foundation of what gets me so frustrated about it.
Right, and that's where I think you and I are in agreement that's part of why I said I just don't have much interest in having a conversation about that. I would much rather talk about how we got here, and this, it's just, and I think one of the sad things about this, to kind of add to your point, is, of course, the saddest thing is the loss of a mother, a 23-year-old woman, a child who's no longer going to have his mom around.
Mm.
From a kind of optics standpoint, outside of that, I would argue that Nate, and you kind of alluded to this, that Nate Oates has been, quote unquote, saying all of the right things. And I really do think he cares and he feels it.
Mm.
It's just hard to put a lot of value in those words when you see that this is the series of events that has unfolded and this is the way Alabama has decided to handle them.
Mm-hmm.
Because you can say whatever you want. And again, I do think that Nate Oates, maybe he was trying to do both, which is incredibly difficult to do in this situation, right? Show the respect for the tragic situation and treat that the way it deserves and protect your player.
Mm.
But the value of the words comes from the actions that back them up, or the lack of value in the words comes from the actions that don't back them up.
Mm.
And that was one of the things that I was thinking about too when he said that was, and from the very beginning, right? Of just not sort of having any kind of accountability for the other, and I just throw Jaden Bradley's name in there. Of course, Jaden Bradley isn't connected to any of this other than the fact that he was also allegedly there. But, right, this is not just an isolated individual within the Alabama men's basketball program. This is, regardless of who the players are, this is 3 players. And, right, one of them being Brandon Miller and another one being an important player on your team in Jaden Bradley. It's hard to put stock in anything that anybody says when there was nothing done outside of what I would argue had to be done in terms of Darius Miles. Excuse me, right?
Mm.
And that's also one of the things I keep coming back to in terms of having this conversation now is we should have been having this conversation a month ago. Alabama chose, and again, maybe there are legal reasons for this, of course, right? You want to get all the information. You can also say that, though.
Mm.
And Alabama chose to not acknowledge in any way, shape, or form the involvement of anybody outside of Darius Miles.
Mm.
And so that inherently devalues anything you say because the message that's being sent by the way Alabama has behaved over the last month is we're doing everything we can to keep our team together this season, to increase our chances of winning a national championship, and to keep Brandon Miller on the floor.
Mm.
Whether that was the intention or not, you can draw your own conclusions about all of that. That is how it is coming across. And there hasn't really been much of an acknowledgement of that until everybody went after Nate Oates because Nate Oates said something incredibly insensitive.
Mm.
And even the response, some of those apologies just blow me away because I feel like they don't actually acknowledge the bigger problem, which was that Alabama has taken no responsibility for the involvement of the other 2 players.
Mm.
Whatever involvement that is, right? You don't have to go throw them under the bus, quote unquote, but you also don't have to pretend like they weren't there and that they weren't somehow involved in a situation that, again, was tragic enough and could have been much worse.
Mm.
Considering that a firearm was brought to a location with all kinds of people, right? And so it's just hard for me to put stock in words when actions are showing you something different. And that's one of the things I'm wrestling with as well. Because I want to believe that Nate Oates cares a great deal and is about the right things and truly believes he's doing what's best for Brandon Miller in terms of not Brandon Miller, the basketball player, but in terms of what he knows about the situation and the way he decided to handle it. Mm-hmm. That basketball was not the number one consideration. I want to believe all of that. it's just hard to lean in that direction and give that the benefit of the doubt when everything else is suggesting otherwise.
Yeah. And I think, and kind of the last thing I have is it's kind of created this, like, I think in some ways it's actually like done a disservice to Brandon Miller.
Yeah.
Because it's either because it quite, like, before the attorney's statement especially, like, not only does it make the program look bad, but then it, like, completely, like intentional or not, on the Alabama side, it completely leaves Brandon Miller out to dry and with a target on his back.
Yep. And then further exacerbated that by what Nate Oats said.
Right. Because when Nate Oats first talked to the media, basically what we knew is that Brandon Miller was there and Nate Oats doesn't seem to care, right? Like that, like those were the two main bullet points, right? And right, we knew that Brandon Miller, quote unquote, provided the gun. This was right before the attorney's statement, that Brandon Miller provided a gun to a murder, right? And Nate Oats doesn't care. Those were the two things that we knew, and there's just no way, like yes, there would have been some, but it would have been much more. It would have been much less speculatory and much more what's the word, much less speculatory and much more, I don't know, wonderment. Just like if you come out just days after and say Brandon Miller was there were other Alabama men's basketball players there. From what we know from Brandon and from the police and all of the investigators involved, we at this moment do not believe that Brandon Miller was of any knowing wrongdoing, right? And then we can have, then the worst conversation that can be had is Alabama's making a mistake letting Brandon Miller play basketball.
Exactly. Yep. And does this hurt his NBA draft stock?
Right. Like that is and then things, but other than that, that's the only thing that you can say, right? It's not, because the initial reaction won't be, did Brandon Miller help kill somebody? Right. And that was the initial reaction when the report came out earlier this week.
And that's what happens.
Did Brandon Miller help kill somebody? And that would have, if you had just come out with it early, that he was there, and we do not feel like he was involved in a with malicious intent, that he was wrong place, wrong time. Like that is the right time. That is the right time to say wrong place, wrong time. Right. And then that creates a barrier automatically between the murder and Brandon Miller. Right. And instead, a month later, it comes out that he was there, and immediately people's brains go to Brandon Miller was involved in that murder, not Brandon Miller just happened to be there. And then your statement, wrong place, wrong time, makes you, can be woven into the context of we're still figuring things out, and not I'm trying to cover up how the best player on my team was involved in a murder. Right. And that adds to the irresponsibility of, because like I'll admit, like it's been, I had to kind of dig myself out of the Brandon Miller was involved in this murder.
Yep. Same
hole. I guess I had to, put the dirt back. I always find that funny. Dig myself out of a hole. You can't dig yourself out of a hole. The hole just gets bigger, right? You dig yourself out of a hole. How do you dig yourself out of a hole?
It's a very profound point I had never considered before.
Sorry, I said I wouldn't make any more jokes. But like I had to, and I think a lot of people are probably in the same boat, that that now, right, between, right, the Alabama, the AL.com reports and the attorney's statement, and now you're kind of wrestling with where's the middle ground where both of these things meet, and that's what actually happened.
Mm-hmm.
And from a Brandon Miller specific standpoint, because that would have been still hairy because the entire situation is hairy, right?
Right.
But that would have been a much more advantageous position to put your player in.
Yep.
To immediately create benefit of the doubt and plausible deniability that he had anything to actually do with the bad things that happened on January 15th.
Yeah, 100%. Couple things to that. One, right, by not doing anything, now this is right or wrong. The headlines are about Brandon Miller now, not the loss of life and not Darius Miles.
Right. It's a really interesting point, actually.
Because that originally, that had all been addressed. And, of course, you can never, not to just dismiss it and say that we move on, because of course you don't. Somebody lost their life. That's the most important thing here, as we keep coming back to. But from a news, very sort of a cynical news cycle standpoint, this all got brought back up again because the Brandon Miller stuff came out, and it needs to be addressed, and questions need to be asked. You chose not to do that the first time. Second thing is, this is another example of why controlling stories is important. The minute you pass up the opportunity to do anything initially, you've lost control of this. And so now, Nate Oats is up there in something that I would argue he should have been better prepared for, but also he didn't sign up to have to answer questions about this kind of stuff, right? And to coach his team through this. Doesn't excuse the way it's been handled. But you have somebody whose job is not to be answering questions like this kind of stuff, now having to answer questions specifically about this because you lost control of the story when you tried to frame it the way that Alabama did originally. And then the third thing I do want to bring up quickly, in terms of kind of the way that this is bounced back and forth, and right, you and I both had to rethink our views on this once more information, or at least another side of this, was presented. I do think it's important to also recognize, and I learned this, or at least kind of fully came to better appreciate this working at a TV station in news. It's not the police's, let me rephrase that. The police aren't going to frame things a certain way, present it in the most clear, easy to understand way. Because, like we've pointed out, and I'm referring to the provided the gun part of this, right? The police are not, when you're giving testimony, I don't feel like the police are concerned with the optics of what they're saying, because that's not really their job, right? Their job is to provide information. And like you said, factually, Brandon Miller provided the gun. Now, there are 400 different interpretations of what that means now based on the different sides that have the information that's been presented. And that nuance is very important in terms of Brandon Miller's role in all of this, obviously. But, and I definitely made this mistake of that phrase comes out and we kind of take it to mean this one thing when I'm not even sure that's actually what the police officer or whoever was giving the testimony meant when that came out.
Sure.
Right? They were just factually saying Brandon Miller provided the gun. Regardless of what actually happened, that is true, like you said earlier. Now, did he do it sort of unintentionally and not even knowing it's there? Or was it more thought out and more cynical than that? That's what we don't know. But I think that's an important. I kept thinking about that as well. That it is important to remember where this information is coming. It's coming from this kind of independent third party who is not interested in the optics and what this means for Alabama's men's basketball.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was certainly guilty of kind of running with that and putting my own spin on it, because when I see provided, it means I take that to mean a very specific thing, which in this case, in the literal definition of the word doesn't necessarily mean that. So I wanted to throw that out there as well in terms of kind of the match that ignited all of this, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't have a ton left. I think I've laid out my thoughts, and it's a truly tragic situation that when intertwined with college athletics, can get really hairy really quickly, and you unfortunately have to doubt the motivations sometimes when it comes to things directly impacting teams that are as high, as talented, and as high up in the hierarchy, so to speak, as Alabama men's basketball is this year. So, do you have anything else? Anything you want to add before we get out of here?
The final thing I think we should also acknowledge on the court, again, right? This is the least of anybody's, the lowest on the priority totem pole, if you will, with all of this.
Mm-hmm.
But it does say something about Brandon Miller, the basketball player, that he was able to, again, whether you think he should be on the court or not, he was able to go on the court and do what he did after, I would argue, the way that he had been let down by, again, I'm sort of picking the very small piece and leaving the bigger, more important things out for a second. But the way that
fine.
He had kind of been
45 minutes with the bigger piece.
Right. That he had kind of been left out to dry to a certain extent by Alabama with the way that this all played out this week. And for him to go do what he did was awfully impressive. Again, nowhere near the most important thing, but if we're having this conversation, I think that needs to be a small part of it as well.
I think, and I'm not in Brandon Miller's head, but I'm in my head, and if I was really involved in a murder to the extent that it would weigh on my conscience, and me personally being just being there would weigh on my conscience. So this isn't totally there's nothing scientific or factual about what I'm about to say, but even the things in this world that I'm the best at, the things that would be my basketball to Brandon Miller, I'm not sure I could do them to the extent that he's to the level at which he's continued to do them if I was really involved in a way that was being hidden and trying to be, and while we're trying to coerce people into thinking something that's not actually true. Now, make of that what you will. Maybe he's just they all could just be spectacular liars, and the best liars are just able to separate themselves from the lie right after they say it, right? So like I said, this is all just kind of from what I know about myself personally and the way that guilt can weigh on me, and the feeling of guilt can weigh on me, that I couldn't do anything. I definitely couldn't be really good on a podcast that would kind of eat me up. So I think that can be part of the situation. At least it's kind of been a very small part of it for me.
That's all I got.
All right. We did our best. We are certainly not legal experts. We are certainly not. Um, I mean, it's certainly not especially fun to talk about these kind of things, and it's a podcast that is much more interested in what's going on the basketball court. We talk about all the time. We repeat that for weeks leading up to seasons, and so that is what we're most interested in. But we decided this was an important thing to talk about, so we tried our best to piece our ways through it in the most respectful and hopefully add some value to the conversation as well. So we'll be back on Monday, and assuming nothing crazy has happened in the development in this story, I mean, we probably wouldn't spend another podcast talking about it, but if we need to talk about it more, we will. But hopefully the center of the college basketball world this weekend can be what's happening on the basketball court, and we can return to chit-chatting about the games as we get ever closer to March 12th and Selection Sunday. So please subscribe to the Jays for Days podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. Follow us on Twitter at Jays for Days Pod. Check out the YouTube, Twitter, TikTok, all of those. We'll be back on Monday. Thank you so much for listening to this edition of the Jays for Days podcast. I'm Josh. He's Josh. And we will see you later.